Am I being detained, officer? Or can I flip my ribs? I clicked my stainless steel barbecue tongs twice in the air. Click, click. It's a reflex. Any man standing over a 500-degree offset smoker knows you have to test the tongs. It's the law. Unfortunately, the actual law was currently standing on my meticulously manicured Bermuda grass. 2 of them, to be exact. Sedona Police Department. One was a veteran officer who looked like he hadn't slept since 1998, sporting a mustache that belonged on a 1970s television detective. His name tag read Davis. The other was a rookie, practically vibrating with nervous energy, his hand resting a little too close to his utility belt. Miller. And then there was Brenda. Brenda was standing on the public sidewalk, safely beyond my property line, pointing a perfectly manicured, acrylic-tipped finger at me like I was a supervillain holding the city hostage. She was wearing a beige sun hat that was entirely too large for her head and a pastel athletic set that had never once seen a gym. "See?" Brenda shrieked, her voice cutting through the dry, perfect Arizona heat. "He's doing it again! He is operating an illegal commercial enterprise and hosting an unpermitted public gathering in a residential zone. Arrest him!" I stared at her through the thin, fragrant haze of hickory smoke. "Brenda," I said slowly, keeping my voice dangerously calm. "It's a Sunday. I am smoking a brisket. My friends are sitting in lawn chairs drinking light beer. Unless being incredibly average is a felony now, I think we're good here." I gestured to the backyard. 10 of my friends. 10. We were scattered around the patio. Someone was holding a frisbee. It was the least threatening gathering in the history of the American Southwest. I'd spent the entire morning staring at my ClickUp board inside, trying to figure out a production catch-up plan for a terrifying backlog of 16 long-form videos for a massive client. My brain was completely fried from staring at timelines and Slack messages. I needed this. I needed the smoke, the quiet sizzle of fat rendering, and the absolute mindlessness of watching meat turn brown. Officer Davis sighed. It was a heavy, soul-crushing sigh. He took off his sunglasses and pinched the bridge of his nose. "Mr. Davis paused, looking down at a small notepad. "Jake," I said. "Just Jake." "Jake," Davis repeated, sounding like every syllable cost him money. "We got a call about a public nuisance, a disturbance of the peace, and operating an unauthorized open-flame kitchen?" He looked up at me, then at the smoker. "Is that a Traeger?" "Custom offset," I corrected him, feeling a tiny spike of pride. "Quarter-inch steel. Drafts like a dream. You want a burnt end? They're almost ready." "Officers, do not accept bribes from the perpetrator!" Brenda screeched from the sidewalk. She took half a step onto my driveway before catching herself and backing up, knowing full well I had security cameras pointed exactly at the property line. "Ma'am, please," Officer Miller, the rookie, said. He puffed his chest out, trying to sound authoritative. "We are conducting an investigation." He turned to me. "Sir, the Homeowners Association bylaws state that any gathering of more than 6 individuals outside the primary dwelling requires a 48-hour advance notice to the board, and any structural cooking apparatus must be concealed from street view." I stared at the rookie. "Are you a cop or an enforcer for the HOA?" Miller flushed red. "I enforce municipal codes, sir." "Right," I said. I set the tongs down on the wooden prep table. I wiped my hands on my apron. I walked over to the edge of the patio, closing the distance between myself and the officers. "Let's break this down. The CC&Rs of the Red Rock Estates Homeowners Association, which, by the way, I have read front to back, do state that permanent structural cooking apparatuses need to be concealed. This smoker is on wheels. It's temporary." I kicked the heavy-duty caster wheel at the base of the smoker. It squeaked, but it rolled. Barely. "As for the gathering," I continued, leaning forward slightly, "this isn't a public gathering. It's a private residence. I'm having friends over for lunch. If you want to cite me for a noise violation, you need a decibel meter. Do you have a decibel meter, Officer Miller? Miller opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at Davis. Davis just looked at the brisket. Smells incredible, son. Truly. Officer Davis, Brenda yelled, stomping her foot. He is creating a smoke hazard. The fumes are drifting onto my property. It's a health and safety violation. Davis slowly turned around to face Brenda. The sheer exhaustion radiating from this man was palpable. Ma'am, it's barbecue. It's not toxic waste. It violates Section 4, Paragraph B of the Neighborhood Environmental Standards, she snapped back, pulling her phone out as if she were going to read it to him. Look, Davis said, turning back to me. He lowered his voice. Jake, I don't want to be here. You don't want me to be here. But she has called dispatch 4 times in the last hour. My captain is breathing down my neck because she knows the mayor. Just wrap it up, okay? Put the fire out. Put the fire out? I repeated, my voice rising in disbelief. I'm 10 hours into a 14-hour cook. If I put the fire out now, I ruin $100 worth of prime beef. I can cite you for the smoke, Jake, Davis warned gently. City ordinance on open burning. It's a stretch, but I can do it. Don't make me do it. I looked at Davis. I looked at Miller. Then I looked past them, to the sidewalk, where Brenda was smiling. It was a smug, victorious, thin-lipped smile, the kind of smile that made you want to commit a crime just to wipe it off. She wasn't just being a nuisance, she was exercising power. She loved this. She thrived on it. Fine. Okay, I said quietly. I turned around and walked back to the smoker. I closed the heavy steel lid. I grabbed the ash bucket and a jug of water. I dumped the water into the firebox. A massive plume of white steam and ash erupted into the air, clouding the entire yard. The hissing sound was deafening. It sounded like a dying dragon. My friends groaned from the patio. The brisket was dead. The party was over. Thank you, sir, Officer Davis said, coughing slightly through the ash cloud. Have a good afternoon. The cops turned and walked back to their cruiser. Brenda watched them go, her chest puffed out in triumph. As they pulled away, she took 2 steps up my driveway. You'll be getting a fine in the mail, she called out, her voice dripping with venom. $500 for the unauthorized gathering and the nuisance smoke. And if I see that rusted metal monstrosity in your yard again, it'll be $1,000. I didn't yell. I didn't scream. I just stood there, gripping the edge of the cold firebox, staring at her. Have a blessed day, Brenda, I said softly. She scoffed, spun on her heel, and marched back to her house. I looked down at the ruined meat. A switch flipped in my brain. It wasn't just anger. It was cold, calculating clarity. Brenda didn't just ruin my lunch. She had weaponized the system against me. She used vague rules and local ordinances to impose her will on my property. She liked playing with rules. All right, Brenda, let's play. By 8 a.m. on Monday, I was already making calls. I didn't just want a smoker anymore. I wanted a monument. I wanted a structure so massive, so incredibly permanent, that it would block Brenda's view of the Red Rock Mountains forever. I needed a contractor. But not just any contractor. I needed someone who understood the local zoning laws, someone who wasn't afraid of the HOA, and most importantly, someone who appreciated the art of smoked meats. Enter Mike. Mike pulled up to my house in a battered Ford F-250 that sounded like it was running on gravel and spite. He stepped out of the truck, a massive, barrel-chested man with a beard that could hide a small bird. He was wearing faded Carhartts, a dusty t-shirt, and a pair of work boots that had seen more miles than most commercial airliners. You the guy who wants to build the outdoor kitchen? Mike grunted, walking up my driveway without introducing himself. I'm the guy who wants to build a fortress of meat, I corrected him, shaking his massive, calloused hand. I'm Jake. Mike cracked a grin. Show me the spot. I led him to the backyard, right to the exact spot where the smoker had been parked the day before. The grass was still slightly charred from the water ash explosion. Here, I said, pointing to a large, open patch of lawn that directly faced Brenda's property line. I want a pavilion, cedar posts, corrugated metal roof, poured concrete foundation, and I want a custom 500-gallon offset smoker permanently bolted into the concrete. Mike whistled low. That's a hell of a setup. You got architectural plans? Not yet. You got permits? Working on it. Mike crossed his massive arms. He looked around the pristine, overly manicured neighborhood. You know you live in Red Rock Estates, right? The HOA here is tighter than a drum. They don't let you paint your mailbox without a committee hearing. They're never going to approve a massive outdoor kitchen with a metal roof. They only allow earth tones and stucco finishes. I know, I said. Mike narrowed his eyes. So, what's the play here, kid? I don't build illegal structures, not because I care about the rules, but because I ain't tearing down my own work when the city hits you with an injunction. I'm not going to build an illegal structure, I said smoothly. I'm going to build a perfectly legal structure. I just need to figure out how to make them approve it. Excuse me? The shrill voice cut through the morning air like a siren. Mike and I both turned. Brenda was standing at the edge of her property, holding a tiny, shivering rat dog on a bedazzled leash. She was glaring at Mike's truck, then glaring at Mike. Is this a commercial vehicle? Brenda demanded, marching over to the property line. Commercial vehicles are not permitted to be parked on the street for more than 30 minutes unless actively loading or unloading. Mike stared at her. He looked down at his truck, then back at her. Lady, I am actively loading my foot up your ass if you don't lower your voice. I choked on a laugh. I already loved Mike. Brenda gasped, clutching her pearls. Literally, she was wearing pearls at 8:30 in the morning. How dare you? I am the president of the Homeowners Association. Congratulations, Mike deadpanned. I'm the guy trying to measure a patio. Kick rocks. You cannot build a patio without submitting plans to the Architectural Review Board, Brenda shrieked, pointing her acrylic finger at me. And considering your little stunt yesterday, I can guarantee you that the board will not approve a single brick you want to lay on this property. She yanked the rat dog's leash and stormed away, her heels clicking aggressively on the pavement. Mike watched her go, then spat into the grass. Charming lady, you married her? Neighbor, I said, rubbing my temples. And she's right. She's the HOA president. She controls the architectural board. If I submit plans for an outdoor kitchen, she'll deny them indefinitely. She can cite visual impact, noise concerns, fire hazards. She holds all the cards. Mike sighed, pulling a tape measure from his belt. Then we're dead in the water, Jake. You can't beat the HOA at their own game. They wrote the rule book. He was right. You can't beat them at their own game. Which meant I needed to stop playing their game. I needed to play a completely different game. A game they didn't even know the rules to. Hold off on the measurements for a few days, Mike, I said, a slow smile creeping onto my face. Let me do some reading. I'll call you when I have the plans. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at my home office desk, surrounded by empty coffee mugs, the glow of my monitor illuminating the dark room. I wasn't editing videos. I wasn't looking at ClickUp. I was deep in the absolute trenches of federal property law, zoning loopholes, and legal precedents. I read through the entire Red Rock Estates CC&R document again. It was a nightmare of restrictions. No sheds over 6 feet tall, no visible fire pits, no unapproved architectural modifications. I started searching for ways around local zoning. I searched for HOA loopholes. I searched for how to bypass architectural committees. Most of the advice was useless. Stuff like run for the board or petition your neighbors. I didn't have time for a democratic process. I wanted a nuclear option. And then, around 3 a.m., I found it. I was browsing a obscure legal forum when I saw a comment from a guy in Texas. He had built a massive ham radio tower in his backyard, completely violating his HOA's height restrictions. When the HOA sued him, he didn't fight the height rule. He cited federal law, specifically the FCC regulations that protect amateur radio operators. The federal law preempted the HOA contract. He won. Federal law preempts HOA rules. I sat up straight in my chair. My heart started pounding. I furiously started typing. What other federal laws completely override local zoning and HOA regulations? Fair Housing Act. No, that's about discrimination in buying/renting. Americans with Disabilities Act. No, I don't need a ramp. I need a smoker. And then I typed the magic words. Federal laws protecting religious land use. The screen populated with results. I clicked the first link. It was a Wikipedia page. I read the title, The Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act, RLUIPA, of 2000. I started reading. I read faster and faster, my eyes darting across the screen. RLUIPA is a United States federal law that protects religious institutions from unduly burdensome or discriminatory land use regulations. Section 2A of RLUIPA states that no government shall impose or implement a land use regulation in a manner that imposes a substantial burden on the religious exercise of a person, including a religious assembly or institution. I stopped breathing. I scrolled down to the legal definitions. What constitutes a government under RLUIPA? States, counties, municipalities, and any agency or official thereof. Wait, does an HOA count? I opened a new tab. Does RLUIPA apply to HOAs? I found a barrage of legal journals and court cases. The answer was complex, but beautiful. While a private HOA is generally a matter of contract law, if the HOA attempts to use local municipal zoning codes or involves the city police to enforce its rules regarding property use, it intertwines with state action, making RLUIPA applicable. Furthermore, the Fair Housing Act prevents HOAs from discriminating based on religion. But RLUIPA was the heavy hitter. If I wanted to build a structure, and the city/HOA tried to stop me using land use regulations, and I could prove that structure was essential to my religious exercise, they couldn't stop me. They legally could not stop me without facing a massive federal civil rights lawsuit. I leaned back in my chair. The quiet hum of my computer was the only sound in the room. I didn't need an outdoor kitchen, I needed a church. I spent the next 3 days in an absolute fugue state of caffeine and legal jargon. Honestly, I didn't even check my email. I just sat in my home office, watching the Arizona sun track across the red rocks outside my window, while I plunged into the dark, terrifying, incredibly boring labyrinth of the IRS tax code. If you want to beat an HOA, you can't just say, "Hey, I'm a religion now, back off." That's how you get laughed out of court and fined into oblivion. You have to be airtight. You have to beat them with bureaucracy. And nobody, I mean literally nobody, has more bureaucracy than the Internal Revenue Service. To get RLUIP protections, you have to prove you are a legitimate religious institution. The IRS uses a 14-point test to determine if an organization qualifies as a church. You don't have to meet all 14, but you need to hit the majority of them. I printed out the list and taped it to my wall next to a schematic of the 500-gallon offset smoker I wanted to buy. Point 1. A distinct legal existence. Easy. I spent $50 on the state website and registered a non-profit corporation in the state of Arizona. The First Assembly of the Sacred Ember. Done. Point 2. A recognized creed and form of worship. I opened a blank Google Doc. I cracked my knuckles. I was a digital project manager by day. I wrote marketing copy and project briefs for a living. Writing a holy text was basically just writing a really aggressive brand guideline. Our creed was simple. The path to enlightenment is paved with patience. The raw meat represents the flawed mortal soul. The hickory fire represents the purifying trials of life. Through the slow, agonizing application of heat and smoke, the tough connective tissues of our worldly sins are rendered down, transforming us into something tender and divine. I literally brought myself to tears writing it. It was beautiful. Point 3. A definite and distinct ecclesiastical government. I appointed myself the High Pit Master. Point 4. A formal code of doctrine and discipline. This was the fun part. I wrote out the 10 commandments of the sacred ember. Number 1. Thou shalt not boil ribs. Number 2. Thou shalt not use lighter fluid, for it taints the holy fire. Number 3. The Texas crutch, wrapping the meat in aluminum foil to speed up the cooking process, is permissible only in times of great spiritual fatigue, but butcher paper is the preferred vestment of the Lord. Number 4. Thou shalt rest thy meat for at least 2 hours before slicing, lest the holy juices be lost to the cutting board. Point 5. A distinct religious history. I cited the indigenous peoples of the Americas, specifically the Taino tribe, who invented the barbacoa. We were merely continuing a sacred, ancestral tradition of community and fire. Point 6. A congregation. I needed believers. I picked up my phone and opened the group chat with my buddies. I sent a single text. Free brisket, ribs, and pulled pork for life. Beer provided. Meeting at my house in 20 minutes. Mandatory. They all showed up. Steve, Michael, Saul, and a few others from my production crew. They walked into my kitchen, looking confused, and found me standing at the island with a stack of printed papers, 3 highlighters, and a 6-pack of Holy Sacrament, otherwise known as local Sedona IPA. "What is this, Jake?" Steve asked, eyeing the paperwork suspiciously. "Are you making us sign NDAs again for that weird client project?" "No," I said, sliding a pen across the granite counter. "I'm saving my backyard, and I need you guys to join a cult." Michael blinked. "A cult?" "A legally recognized, tax-exempt religious institution," I corrected him. "Listen to me. Brenda got the cops to shut down the smoker on Sunday. She threatened me with a $1,000 fine if I bring it back out. If I submit plans to build a permanent structure, the HOA will deny it." "So?" Saul asked, cracking a beer. "Just build it stealthy." "You can't stealth build a poured concrete pavilion with a steel roof, Saul," I said, exasperated. "But if we are a church, and that pavilion is our altar, the federal government says the HOA cannot use zoning laws to impose a substantial burden on our religious exercise." I slammed my hand down on the printout of the RLUEPA statute. "Federal law, boys. It preempts CCNRs. But a church needs a congregation. I need signatures. I need a board of directors." Steve picked up the doctrinal charter I had written. He read it silently for about 2 minutes. Then he looked up at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of horror and profound respect. "You wrote that boiling ribs is a mortal sin, punishable by excommunication?" Steve asked. "It is," I said deadpan. "Will you sign?" Steve didn't even hesitate. He clicked the pen and scrawled his name on the charter. Michael and Saul followed suit. Within 20 minutes, I had 10 official founding members of the First Assembly of the Sacred Ember. We held our first official board meeting right there in the kitchen, where we unanimously voted to allocate our entire operating budget to the acquisition of prime-grade beef and cedar lumber. The next step was the most crucial. Point 7. Ordained ministers. You can't just call yourself a priest. So I spent 3 minutes on the website for the Universal Life Church, filled out a form, and for $29 I became an officially ordained minister, legally recognized in all 50 states. I printed my certificate on heavy cardstock. I had the corporation. I had the doctrine. I had the congregation. I had the ordination. I had filled out IRS Form 1023 to apply for official 501c3 tax-exempt status, which, legally speaking, meant we were operating as a church in good faith while pending approval. It was time to go to war. I didn't call Mike the contractor just yet. First, I needed the HOA to officially deny my architectural plans, so I had a documented paper trail of their discrimination. I went into AutoCAD, a perk of my digital production background, and drafted a set of architectural plans. But I didn't label it an outdoor kitchen. At the top of the blueprint, in massive, bold font, I wrote, "Proposed sanctuary and sacrificial altar for the first assembly of the sacred ember." I labeled the concrete slab the foundation of fellowship. I labeled the cedar pavilion the canopy of the divine. And right in the center, I drew the exact dimensions of a custom 500-gallon offset smoker, labeling it the altar of the rendered fat. I printed the plans, put them in a nice manila envelope, and walked down the street to Brenda's house. I rang the doorbell. Brenda opened the door. She was wearing another pastel tracksuit, this one a horrific shade of peach, and holding that trembling rat dog. When she saw me, her eyes narrowed into 2 venomous slits. "If you are here to complain about the fine, you need to submit a grievance in writing to the board," she snapped, moving to shut the door. "Oh, I'm not here about the fine, Brenda," I said, giving her my most beaming customer service smile. "I'm here to submit my architectural plans for a new structure in my backyard. As per the bylaws, I'm handing them directly to the president of the Architectural Review Committee." I held out the envelope. Brenda didn't take it. She just stared at it like it was a live grenade. "You're submitting plans? After Sunday? You really think I'm going to approve a patio for you to throw your little frat parties?" "It's not a patio, Brenda," I said softly. "It's a place of worship." She finally snatched the envelope out of my hand. She ripped it open and pulled out the blueprint. I watched her eyes scan the page. I watched the gears turning in her head. I watched the exact moment her brain short-circuited trying to process the words, "sacrificial altar." "What is this?" she whispered, her voice trembling with absolute fury. "Is this a joke? Altar of the rendered fat? First assembly of the sacred? What is this garbage?" "It's my constitutionally protected religious faith, Brenda," I said, placing my hand over my heart. "I have recently found spiritual awakening, and my congregation requires a sanctuary to perform our sacred rites." "You're a lunatic," she spat, her face turning the exact color of her tracksuit. "I am denying this immediately. Denied. Automatically denied. It violates the aesthetic guidelines, it violates the setback rules, and it violates common decency. You will never build this eyesore." "Could you put that in writing?" I asked politely. "I'll do better than that," Brenda yelled. "I'll have the HOA lawyers send you a cease and desist. If you even dig a hole in that yard, I will have the city slap a lien on your house." She slammed the door in my face. I stood on her porch for a second, just soaking it in. The warm Arizona breeze blew past me. It was a beautiful day for a lawsuit. I walked home and immediately drafted a certified letter. I didn't send it to Brenda. I sent it to the HOA's legal counsel, a mid-sized firm over in Flagstaff. I kept it extremely professional, incredibly dry, and absolutely terrifying. I formally notified them that the First Assembly of the Sacred Ember, a recognized religious institution operating within the state of Arizona, was claiming protection under the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act, or LUIPA, of 2000. I stated that the HOA president had explicitly demonstrated religious animus by verbally denying our sanctuary plans without a formal committee review. I attached copies of the state incorporation, the IRS 1023 filing receipt, my certificate of ordination, and a copy of the denied blueprints. I ended the letter with a very simple ultimatum. Any further attempts by the Red Rock Estates Homeowners Association to impose a substantial burden on our religious exercise, including but not limited to the levying of fines, the issuance of stop-work orders, or the harassment of our clergy, will result in immediate federal litigation for civil rights violations under 42 U.S.C. Section 1983. I overnighted the letter. Then I called Mike. "Mike," I said when he picked up, "the plans are ready. We break ground tomorrow." "They approved it?" Mike asked, sounding genuinely shocked. "The Dragon Lady actually approved it?" "Oh, she denied it aggressively," I said. "But it doesn't matter. She doesn't have jurisdiction anymore. Bring the backhoe." The next morning, at exactly 7 a.m., the very minute the city noise ordinance allowed construction to begin, a massive yellow backhoe rolled off a flatbed trailer and onto my driveway. The ground literally shook. I walked out the front door carrying a travel mug of coffee. Mike jumped down from the cab of the backhoe, grinning like a kid on Christmas. He was holding the blueprints I had emailed him the night before. "Jake," Mike said, his voice thick with emotion, "I gotta tell you, I've been building houses in this county for 25 years. I have fought with every zoning board, every permit office, and every HOA dictator from here to Phoenix. When I read your emails last night, I cried. I actually shed a tear." "It's a solid legal strategy," I said humbly. "Solid," Mike boomed. "It's a masterpiece! You weaponized the First Amendment to build a barbecue!" He rolled up the blueprints and tapped them against his palm. "I went online last night. I joined your church. I signed the doctrinal charter." I laughed. "You didn't have to do that, Mike." "I did," Mike said, suddenly looking very serious. "Because as a member of the congregation, I am no longer just a general contractor. I am legally providing a religious service. I am the chief architect of the Sacred Ember. My labor is a sacrament." "Hallelujah," I said. "Start digging the holy foundation." The noise was glorious. The backhoe tore into the perfectly manicured lawn, scooping up massive chunks of earth to prepare for the concrete pour. The smell of diesel exhaust and turned dirt filled the air. It took exactly 14 minutes for Brenda to show up. She came practically sprinting down the sidewalk, her bathrobe flapping in the wind, holding her phone out like a weapon. She wasn't even screaming yet. She was too out of breath. She marched right up to the property line, stopping exactly where my grass met the public concrete. Mike saw her, turned off the backhoe engine, and leaned out of the cab. "What is the meaning of this?" Brenda gasped, pointing a shaking finger at the massive hole in my yard. "I denied your plans. I told you yesterday you do not have approval." "I am calling the police." I took a slow sip of my coffee. I walked over to the property line, staying entirely on my side. I was wearing a black polo shirt with a small, custom-embroidered logo I had ordered overnight. A flame rising from a brisket. "Brenda," I said, using my best, most soothing pastoral voice. "Please lower your voice. This is a place of peace. We are breaking ground on the sanctuary." "It is an illegal structure," she shrieked, finally finding her lungs. "You have no permits. You have no HOA approval. Stop this machine right now." "Actually, Mike rumbled from the backhoe. "We don't need HOA approval for a religious structure under federal law. And as for city permits, agricultural and religious exemption forms were filed with the county clerk at 8 a.m. this morning. We're fully compliant, sister." Brenda stared at Mike, then at me. Her eye was visibly twitching. "Religious exemption? You are a project manager. You make YouTube videos. You are not a priest." I pulled my laminated ordination certificate out of my back pocket and held it up. "I am the High Pitmaster, Brenda. And frankly, your continued presence here, yelling at my chief architect during a sacred groundbreaking ceremony, is starting to feel like religious persecution. I'd hate to have to add you personally to the federal lawsuit." She recoiled, like I had physically struck her. The mention of a federal lawsuit seemed to finally pierce through the red haze of her HOA-fueled rage. She realized, maybe for the first time in her life, that she was entirely out of her depth. You haven't heard the last of this," she stammered, backing away. "I am calling the city inspector. I am calling the mayor. I will have this entire property condemned. May the great smoke bring peace to your troubled soul," I called out after her as she scurried back to her house. Mike fired the backhoe back up. "She's gonna call the city," he yelled over the engine. "Let her," I yelled back. "The paperwork is bulletproof." The next 2 weeks were a master class in malicious compliance and comedic escalation. The construction proceeded at breakneck speed. Mike brought in a crew of guys, all of whom had enthusiastically signed the church charter just to spite the HOA, and they worked like men possessed. They poured a massive 12 by 20-foot concrete slab. They erected massive aromatic cedar posts that smelled like a glorious forest. They framed out a stunning corrugated metal roof that perfectly matched the rustic Sedona aesthetic, even if it explicitly violated the HOA's stucco-only mandate. And then, the centerpiece arrived. It came on a flatbed tow truck, a custom-built 500-gallon reverse-flow offset smoker, painted matte black, with a smokestack that reached 8 feet into the air. It weighed over 2,000 pounds. We had to use a rented crane to lift it off the street and gently lower it onto the concrete altar. It was a breathtaking piece of machinery. It looked like a matte black locomotive. Brenda, meanwhile, completely lost her mind. She couldn't stop the construction because the HOA lawyers had finally read my certified letter. They apparently told her to stand down immediately, realizing that fighting a First Amendment RLUIP case over a barbecue was a fantastic way to bankrupt the association in legal fees. But just because she couldn't issue stop work orders didn't mean she couldn't try to make my life hell. She started issuing fines for everything else. I got a $50 fine in the mail for excessive construction dust. I got a $100 fine for unauthorized parking of heavy machinery. I got a fine because one of Mike's guys played a country music radio station too loudly at lunch. I didn't pay a single one. Every time a fine arrived in my mailbox, I drafted a form letter on my official church letterhead, which featured the flaming brisket logo, stating that the fine was an unconstitutional tax on a religious institution and a blatant attempt to chill my First Amendment rights. I filed them all in a thick binder. Then, Brenda tried to get the city involved. On day 8 of construction, a white pickup truck with the city seal pulled up. A guy named Gary stepped out, wearing a hard hat and carrying a clipboard. He was the chief zoning inspector for the municipality. Gary walked into the backyard, took one look at the massive cedar pavilion and the locomotive-sized smoker, and let out a long, low whistle. "Son," Gary said, shaking his head, "I got a lady down the street calling my office 6 times a day saying you're building a commercial meatpacking plant in a residential zone without a single permit." I walked over, smiling warmly. "Welcome to the First Assembly of the Sacred Ember, Gary. Can I offer you a bottled water?" Gary looked at me, squinting in the sunlight. "Are you messing with me?" I handed him the binder. It contained my IRS 1023 filing, my state incorporation, my letter to the HOA lawyers, and a printed copy of the Arlu Ipia statute, highlighted in neon yellow. Gary opened the binder. He stood in the shade of the cedar canopy and read in silence for about 5 minutes. I could see his lips moving as he read the doctrinal charter regarding the mortal sin of boiling ribs. Slowly, Gary closed the binder. He looked at the smoker. He looked at the perfectly poured concrete. Then he looked at me. "So," Gary said, his voice completely devoid of emotion, "this is an altar." "It is," I confirmed. "And the meat you cook on it is a sacrament." "Correct. And the structure covering it is a sanctuary, essential to your religious practice." "Absolutely," Gary sighed. He tapped his pen against his clipboard. "You know, the city could probably fight this in federal court. We could argue that this isn't a sincerely held religious belief. We could drag this out for 3 years and cost you 50 grand in lawyer fees." "You could," I agreed calmly. "But the burden of proof is on the government under RLUIEP to prove it's a compelling state interest to stop me. And honestly, Gary, does the mayor really want to be the guy who gets sued by the ACLU for shutting down a church barbecue in an election year?" Gary stared at me for a long time. Then a slow, grudging smile spread across his face. "I like ribs," Gary said quietly. "Spare, not baby back. Dry rub, no sauce. Our Sunday services begin at noon," I said. "You are officially invited." Gary handed the binder back to me. "I'll note in my file that no municipal codes are being violated by this religious assembly." "Have a good day, Reverend." "High Pitmaster," I corrected him. Gary tipped his hard hat and walked back to his truck. I watched him drive away. It was a total, unmitigated victory. The city had backed off. The HOA lawyers were terrified. The pavilion was fully constructed, and it was glorious. But it wasn't enough. Brenda was still out there. She was still standing on her porch every morning, glaring at my property, radiating toxic energy. She was still sending me petty fines for grass length and trash can placement. She still thought she had power over me. I didn't just want to build my smoker. I wanted to break her spirit. I wanted to establish dominance so absolute that she would cross the street rather than look at my house. I needed to spring the trap. I went back to my computer and opened Photoshop. I designed an invitation. It was elegant. It had gold foil lettering and a beautiful, rustic aesthetic. It read, "The First Assembly of the Sacred Ember cordially invites you to our inaugural consecration ceremony. Join us for a day of fellowship, holy sacraments, prime brisket and pulled pork, and the blessing of the altar. Sunday, 1 p.m. All are welcome in the eyes of the smoke." I didn't just print one, I printed 200. I spent Saturday morning walking through the entire Red Rock Estates neighborhood. I put an invitation in every single mailbox. I invited the guys with the loud motorcycles. I invited the family with the 6 kids who Brenda constantly harassed for leaving chalk on the sidewalk. I invited everyone who had ever received a passive-aggressive notice from the HOA board. And most importantly, I walked up to Brenda's house, bypassed her mailbox, and taped a special VIP invitation directly to her front door. I knew exactly what she was going to do. Brenda wasn't going to call the HOA lawyers. She knew they wouldn't help her. Brenda wasn't going to call Gary the inspector. She knew he had signed off. Brenda was going to wait until my yard was full of people, music, and smoke. And then she was going to call the cops. She was going to demand they enforce the city's noise and nuisance ordinances. She was going to try and humiliate me in front of the entire neighborhood by having me arrested. I counted on it. I went to the butcher and bought 4 whole Packer briskets, 6 racks of ribs, and 20 pounds of pork shoulder. I bought 3 kegs of local beer. I called Mike and told him to bring his entire crew. Saturday night, at 10 p.m., I lit the fire. I built a bed of coals in the firebox of the massive offset smoker. I threw on 2 logs of seasoned hickory. The fire caught, casting a warm orange glow against the cedar canopy. The smoke drafted perfectly, pulling through the main chamber and out the tall stack, drifting up into the clear, starry Arizona sky. I stood there in the quiet dark, listening to the crackle of the wood. The trap was set. The bait was heavily seasoned with kosher salt and coarse black pepper. Tomorrow, we were going to church. And Brenda was going to be the sacrificial lamb. Sunday morning broke over Sedona like a cracked egg, bright, intensely hot, and completely unapologetic. I was already exhausted, but it was that specific, manic kind of exhaustion you only get when you've been awake for 26 hours nursing a live fire and plotting the absolute destruction of a homeowners association president. I stepped out onto the back patio, holding a mug of black coffee. The air was thick with the holy incense of our order, rendered beef fat, hickory smoke, and the faint, sweet smell of the new cedar pavilion baking in the morning sun. I walked up to the altar. The massive steel door of the offset smoker was hot to the touch. I popped the latch and lifted it. Honestly, it was a religious experience. 4 massive briskets sat on the grates, their exteriors transformed into a dark, craggy, mahogany bark. I poked the thickest part of the point muscle with my index finger. It yielded like room temperature butter. Perfection. The ribs were pulled back from the bone, glazed and shimmering. The pork shoulders were quite literally falling apart under their own weight. "Praise be," Mike said, stepping through my side gate. He was holding 2 massive bags of ice and wearing his official Sacred Ember black apron. His entire crew, 5 burly guys who looked more like a biker gang than a construction crew, filed in behind him, all wearing matching aprons. "The sacraments are almost ready, Chief Architect," I said, closing the heavy steel lid. "Are the coolers set up?" "Coolers are loaded," Mike said, dumping the ice into a massive trough we'd built alongside the pavilion. "I brought 3 kegs from that brewery down in Oak Creek. The owner threw in a 4th for free when I told him what we were doing. Turns out Brenda tried to get his food truck towed last year from a neighborhood block party. The Lord works in mysterious ways," I deadpanned. By 12:30 p.m., the backyard was completely transformed. We had set up 4 long folding tables draped in black tablecloths. We had string lights zigzagging across the cedar canopy. We had a playlist of classic rock and blues softly playing from a Bluetooth speaker. And then the congregation arrived. I had expected maybe 20 people. I had drastically underestimated how much this neighborhood hated Brenda. At 12:45, a family of 4 walked tentatively up my driveway. The father was holding the gold foil invitation I had taped to their mailbox. I recognized him. He was the guy who got fined $300 because his kids drew hopscotch squares on the sidewalk with washable chalk. "Hey," he said, looking nervously at the massive smoker. "Is this real? Like free barbecue?" "Welcome to the sanctuary, brother," I said, shaking his hand and handing him a cold beer. "The food is free. The fellowship is mandatory. Grab a plate." By 1:15 p.m., there were 45 people in my backyard. It was incredible. It was a beautiful cross-section of suburban rebellion. The guy with the loud motorcycle was there, eating a rib and talking to a retired school teacher who had been cited by Brenda for planting the wrong shade of roses. My video production crew was holding court by the kegs. Everyone was wearing the little flame logo sticker badges I had printed out. The vibe was absolutely immaculate. People were laughing. The food was disappearing at an alarming rate. It was the best block party Red Rock Estates had ever seen. Completely legal, totally immune to HOA bylaws, and deeply, fundamentally antagonistic. I stood under the cedar canopy, slicing brisket with a massive carving knife, handing out portions on butcher paper. "Jake," Steve muttered, leaning over the cutting board. He gestured with his chin toward the front of the house. "You might want to pause the sermon. The Romans are here." I wiped my knife on a towel and looked past the side gate, down the driveway. I saw the flashing lights first. Red and blue, reflecting off the pristine stucco of the neighborhood houses. It wasn't just one police cruiser. Brenda had apparently told dispatch there was a full-scale riot happening. 5 Sedona Police Department SUVs rolled down the street in a slow, dramatic convoy, parking diagonally across my driveway and blocking the street. The music in the backyard abruptly stopped. The chatter died down. 45 people froze, clutching paper plates of pulled pork, their eyes wide with sudden panic. And then, emerging from her house like a conquering general, came Brenda. She wasn't in a tracksuit today. She was wearing a tailored blazer and slacks, dressed for the courtroom. She marched out to the street to meet the officers as they stepped out of their vehicles. She was pointing at my house, pointing at the smoke, her mouth moving a mile a minute. I recognized the first 2 officers walking up the driveway, Davis and Miller, the veteran and the rookie. They looked incredibly tense, their hands resting on their duty belts. "Stay here," I told Steve. I grabbed my phone and the heavy, black, 3-ring binder I had prepped the night before. I walked out from under the pavilion and met the police at the edge of my patio. Brenda was right behind them, practically vibrating with triumphant energy. "All right, shut it down," Officer Miller, the rookie, yelled, trying to project his voice over the crowd. "Everyone put your drinks down. This is an unauthorized commercial gathering. Disperse immediately or face citation." "He's selling meat!" Brenda shrieked from behind Officer Davis, using him as a human shield. "Look at all these people! It's an illegal restaurant! It's a health hazard! Arrest him for operating without a commercial license!" The crowd in my backyard started to murmur anxiously. A few people edged toward the side gate, not wanting to get a ticket. "Nobody move," I said. I didn't yell, but I spoke with absolute, unwavering authority. I turned to the officers. "Gentlemen, welcome back. I'd offer you a plate, but we're in the middle of a service." Officer Davis looked at me, then looked past me at the massive cedar structure, the enormous smoker, and the 40 people staring back at him. He looked like a man who had stared into the abyss and found it filled with barbecue sauce. "Jake," Davis sighed, rubbing his forehead. "What are you doing?" "She called the captain. She called the fire marshal. She said you built an illegal commercial slaughterhouse in your yard and were charging people an entry fee. I have orders to shut this down, clear the property, and issue a criminal citation for zoning fraud." "I told you," Brenda crowed, stepping out from behind Davis. Her face was a mask of pure, unadulterated smugness. "I told you that you wouldn't get away with this. You think you can just bypass the architectural committee? You think you can build whatever monstrosity you want? You are going to jail, and I am going to personally oversee the demolition of that tin-roofed shack." "Officer Davis," I said calmly, completely ignoring Brenda. I held up the black binder. "Before you issue any citations or order anyone to leave, I need you to review these documents." "I don't need to read anything," Miller snapped, stepping forward. "You're in violation of Municipal Code 14.2. "Officer Miller," I interrupted, my voice turning ice cold. "If you issue an order to disperse this gathering, you will be personally named in a federal civil rights lawsuit before you finish your shift." Miller froze. Cops are trained to handle a lot of things. Drunks, fighters, runners. But a calm, completely sober guy in an apron threatening a specific federal lawsuit? That makes them hesitate. I handed the open binder to Officer Davis. "Page 1, I said, dictating the contents as he looked down. "The officially filed and recognized Articles of Incorporation for the First Assembly of the Sacred Ember." a non-profit religious organization registered in the state of Arizona. Page 2. Our filed IRS Form 1023, pending 501c3, tax-exempt status, granting us presumptive church status. Page 3. My legally binding ordination certificate. Davis was staring at the papers. His mustache twitched. "He printed that off the internet," Brenda yelled, though her voice wavered slightly. "It's a fake. He's just a YouTuber." Page 4, I continued, speaking over her. A copy of the Federal Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act of 2000. Specifically, the section that states municipalities cannot use zoning codes to impose a substantial burden on religious exercise. And page 5, a signed affidavit from Gary, your municipal zoning inspector, who visited this property 3 days ago and officially determined that this structure is a religious sanctuary exempt from local HOA and city architectural restrictions. Davis flipped to page 5. He stared at Gary's signature. Then he looked up at me. "Jake," Davis said quietly, "are you telling me—" "I am telling you, Officer Davis," I said, pitching my voice loud enough for Brenda and the rest of the neighborhood to hear, "that this is not a commercial gathering. No money has changed hands. This is not a restaurant. This is the inaugural consecration ceremony of our newly built sanctuary. These people are my congregation, and the brisket you smell is our holy sacrament." The silence in the backyard was deafening. You could hear the fat dripping onto the coals in the smoker. "If you order my congregation to leave," I said, locking eyes with the veteran cop, "you are illegally disrupting a recognized religious service. That is a violation of our First Amendment rights and a federal offense under 18 U.S. Code Org. 247. Damage to religious property or obstruction of persons in the free exercise of religious beliefs. The penalty includes fines and imprisonment." I let that hang in the air. Davis slowly closed the binder. He handed it back to me. He looked at the 40 people wearing matching aprons. He looked at the massive, beautifully constructed altar. Then, Officer Davis turned around and faced Brenda. "Ma'am," Davis said, his voice dropping an octave, "you lied to dispatch." Brenda's jaw literally dropped. The smugness vanished, replaced by sheer, uncomprehending panic. "What? No, I didn't. He's lying. It's a barbecue. He just called it a church to get out of a fine." "The legality of his faith is for the IRS and a federal judge to decide, not the Sedona Police Department," Davis stated firmly, stepping toward her. "What I have in front of me is perfectly legal documentation of a religious assembly, approved by the city inspector. You told us there was an unpermitted commercial enterprise and a riot." "He's making a mockery of the neighborhood," Brenda shrieked, backing away as Davis advanced. "He is violating the CC&Rs. I am the president of the HOA." "I don't enforce HOA bylaws, Brenda," Davis snapped, finally losing his cool. "I enforce the law. And right now the only person breaking the law is you." "Me?" "Yes, you," Davis said, pointing a stern finger at her. "Filing a false police report is a misdemeanor. Misusing emergency services is a misdemeanor. Furthermore," Davis paused, looking back at me, then back to Brenda, "you are currently standing on the private property of a religious institution, actively attempting to disrupt a worship service." Brenda looked down. She had, in her fury, marched about 3 feet past the property line and onto my driveway. "Jake," Davis called out, without looking away from Brenda, "as the ordained minister of this facility, do you want this woman on your property?" I smiled. It was a slow, deep, profoundly satisfying smile. "No, officer," I said politely. "Her negative energy is interfering with the smoke ring on my ribs. I'd like her trespassed." Brenda gasped, clutching her chest. "You wouldn't dare." Officer Davis unsnapped the retention strap on his handcuffs. It was a loud, deliberate click. "Brenda," Davis said coldly, "you have exactly 5 seconds to step off this property. If you ever set foot on this property again, or if you ever call dispatch to complain about the smell of this man's religious sacrament, I will arrest you for trespassing and federal religious interference. Do you understand me?" Brenda looked at the handcuffs. She looked at the 5 police cruisers. She looked past me, to the 40 neighbors standing in the backyard. They weren't quiet anymore. Mike the contractor started a slow clap. Steve joined in. Then the guy with the motorcycle. Then the family of 4. Within seconds, the entire backyard was clapping and cheering. Brenda's face turned from pale to a deep, blotchy crimson. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. She spun around, nearly tripping over her own heels, and power-walked, practically ran, back to her house, slamming the front door so hard the glass rattled. The police officers stood there for a moment in the aftermath. Officer Miller looked completely bewildered. Officer Davis just let out a long, exhausted breath. "Davis," I said, walking over to the smoker. I grabbed a pair of tongs, pulled a massive, beautifully smoked beef rib off the grate, wrapped it in butcher paper, and walked back to the driveway. I handed it to him. "Sacrament?" Davis asked, looking at the massive, dripping rib. "Donation for the local constabulary," I corrected. "Stay safe out there." Davis took the meat. A tiny smile broke through his thick mustache. "Amen, Reverend. Have a good service." The cops got back in their cars, killed the flashing lights, and drove away. I walked back under the cedar pavilion. The crowd went absolutely wild. People were high-fiving. Mike picked me up off the ground in a massive bear hug. We had done it. We had beaten the unbeatable boss. We hadn't just won. We had completely humiliated the system by using its own rules against it. "All right, congregation," I yelled over the noise, raising my tongs into the air. "The sermon is over. Let's eat!" The rest of the day was a blur of incredible food, cold beer, and stories of Brenda's past HOA tyrannies, which now felt completely toothless. The beast was slain. The sanctuary was safe. But the revenge wasn't quite complete. Monday morning, I sat back down at my desk. The house was quiet. The smell of hickory smoke still lingered in the air. I opened my email and drafted a message to my attorney. I didn't just want Brenda to leave me alone. I wanted to make sure she could never harass anyone in Red Rock Estates ever again. I attached the police report from Sunday, detailing Brenda's false dispatch calls and her threat of arrest for religious disruption. I attached the thick binder of RLUIPA documentation. I attached every single petty fine she had mailed me over the last 3 weeks. Subject: harassment and civil rights lawsuit initiation. Message: please draft a formal complaint against the Red Rock Estates Homeowners Association Board of Directors and Brenda personally for targeted harassment, religious discrimination, and attempted violation of federal civil rights under RLUIPA. We are seeking a settlement. Terms attached. I hit send. 2 days later, the HOA's legal team received the drafted lawsuit. They apparently took one look at the police report confirming that the city recognized my property as a church, and they completely panicked. They knew that if this went to federal court, the legal fees alone would bankrupt the HOA reserve fund, and they would lose anyway. They begged for a settlement meeting. We met at a neutral conference room in downtown Sedona. I sat on one side of a large glass table with my lawyer. On the other side sat the 3 members of the HOA board. Brenda was not there. "Where is the president?" my lawyer asked, opening his briefcase. Brenda. Brenda resigned her position on the board yesterday evening, the vice president, a nervous-looking man in a golf shirt, said quietly. She felt it was in the best interest of the community. I had to bite the inside of my cheek to stop from laughing out loud. She didn't resign. They forced her out to save themselves. Excellent, my lawyer said smoothly. Then this should be quick. My client is willing to drop the federal discrimination lawsuit, provided the HOA agrees to the following legally binding terms. He slid a single sheet of paper across the table. I watched the new board president read it. His eyes widened. Term 1. The HOA officially recognizes the property as an exempt religious sanctuary, immune from all current and future architectural bylaws. Term 2. The complete nullification of all fines previously issued to the property. Term 3. A formal written apology from the board for religious discrimination. Term 4. A settlement payment of $15,000 to cover legal fees and religious trauma. $15,000. Which, coincidentally, was the exact cost of the cedar lumber, the poured concrete, and the custom 500-gallon offset smoker. The board members looked at each other. They didn't even try to negotiate. They were terrified. We accept, the vice president squeaked. They signed the paperwork right there. A week later, the check cleared. I used it to pay Mike for the construction. We were officially, legally, and financially untouchable. I walked out to the backyard that evening. The sun was setting over the red rocks, casting long, beautiful shadows across the lawn. The cedar pavilion glowed in the fading light. Mike was there, finishing up one last detail. He was drilling 4 heavy screws into the front of the main cedar support post. He stepped back and wiped his brow. "Looks good, Chief Architect," I said, handing him a beer. "Looks permanent," Mike grinned. I looked at the heavy bronze plaque he had just installed. The metal was polished, reflecting the sunset. It read, "The First Assembly of the Sacred Ember, founded 2026, protected by the grace of the smoke, the First Amendment, and federal law." I took a sip of my beer. I looked over at Brenda's house. Her blinds were tightly drawn. Her patio was empty. She hadn't been seen in the front yard for a week. We hadn't just built a smoker. We had built a monument to malicious compliance. We had proven that when petty tyrants try to use the rulebook to crush you, the best revenge isn't breaking the rules. It's finding a bigger, heavier rulebook and dropping it directly on their heads. Stay smart, know your rights, and always keep your brisket low and slow.